The Roman Empire had conquered the known world. It defeated kings, destroyed nations, and crushed every rebellion that stood in its way. So when a Jewish preacher from an obscure province was sentenced to die, no one thought history would remember his name. To Rome, it was just another execution, another cross, another forgotten man. But empires are rarely defeated by what they can see. 2,000 years later, Rome exists only in ruins. The movement born from that execution became the largest religion on earth. How did the greatest empire in history lose to a man who never commanded an army? Rome, the 1st century after Christ. The greatest empire the world had ever known stretched from the cold forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of North Africa. More than 60 million people lived under Roman rule. Its roads connected continents. Its armies crushed rebellions with ruthless efficiency. Its emperors believed their power would last forever. To most people, Rome was unstoppable. Its power seemed absolute, its borders endless, its future unquestionable. Yet, history would remember neither its greatest generals nor its vast wealth as its most enduring legacy. Instead, it would remember a man born in one of the empire's smallest and least important provinces. A man who never commanded an army, never ruled a kingdom, never wrote a single book, never traveled far from his homeland, and died the death of a criminal. By every standard of the ancient world, his story should have ended there. It didn't. Within weeks of his execution, his followers began making an astonishing claim. They insisted their teacher had risen from the dead. Authorities dismissed them. Many laughed. Others demanded their arrest. Some wanted them executed. Because history had already established the rule. When a movement lost its leader, it disappeared. And yet, this one refused to die. Within a single generation, communities devoted to Jesus appeared across the eastern Mediterranean. Within 3 centuries, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire. Within 2,000 years, more than 2 billion people would identify themselves as followers of Christ. But this transformation did not begin inside a palace. It did not begin inside the Roman Senate, nor inside the magnificent Temple of Jerusalem. It began with a handful of frightened men hiding behind locked doors. How did that happen? How did a small Jewish movement become the largest religion on earth? To answer that question, we must leave behind the marble temples of Rome and travel nearly 1,500 miles east to a province so small that many Romans barely knew it existed. The year is roughly AD 30. Although Rome dominates nearly every coastline of the Mediterranean, not every province shares equally in its glory. Far from the imperial capital lies Judea. To Roman officials, it is little more than another troublesome territory. A narrow strip of dry hills, ancient villages, rocky valleys, and a stubborn population with an unusually strong attachment to its traditions. But for the Jewish people who lived there, this was no ordinary land. For centuries, they believed it had been promised to them by God Himself. Every mountain, every valley, every stone carried the weight of sacred history. Their scriptures told stories of Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, exile, return, promises yet to be fulfilled. At the heart of their world stood Jerusalem, and towering above the city, the Second Temple. For Jewish believers, it was far more than an architectural masterpiece. It was where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Pilgrims traveled for days, sometimes weeks, to worship there. Sacrifices filled its courtyards, Priests carried out ancient rituals. Festivals transformed the city into one of the busiest places in the Roman East. Yet beneath this religious devotion, an uncomfortable reality remained. The Jewish people were no longer free. For centuries they had lived beneath one foreign empire after another. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and now Romans. Roman soldiers patrolled their streets. Roman taxes burdened their families. Roman governors possessed the power of life and death. Some accepted life under Roman rule. Others dreamed of rebellion. Many believed that God would soon intervene. Ancient prophecies spoke of a coming Messiah, an anointed one, a deliverer chosen by God. But no one agreed on what that meant. Some imagined another King David, a warrior who would overthrow Rome. Others expected a prophet. Others believed the Messiah would transform not merely Israel, but the entire world. Whatever the answer, expectation filled the air. Few realized that the man who would forever change history was not living in Jerusalem, nor among priests, nor among kings. He lived quietly in the hills of Galilee. Among the scattered villages of northern Galilee stood one so small that it was barely mentioned by ancient historians: Nazareth. It was there that Jesus spent nearly 30 years of his life. Surprisingly, history tells us almost nothing about those years. The New Testament offers only brief glimpses of his childhood. Outside Christian writings, the historical record is almost silent. For nearly 3 decades, the future founder of history's largest religion lived in complete obscurity. Then, everything changed. Around the age of 30, Jesus appeared at the Jordan River. Crowds had already gathered there around another remarkable figure, John the Baptist. John preached repentance. He warned that God's judgment was drawing near. He urged people to prepare themselves for what was coming. Many believed he was a prophet. Some even wondered whether he himself might be the long-awaited Messiah. But John rejected that idea. According to the Gospels, he pointed instead toward Jesus. His baptism marked the beginning of a public ministry that would last only a few years, yet permanently reshape human civilization. Jesus did not seek influence among governors. He did not visit Rome. He did not surround himself with scholars or military leaders. Instead, he walked village after village, town after town, speaking beside lakes, teaching inside synagogues, crossing dusty roads beneath the Galilean sun. His audience consisted of ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, widows, tax collectors, children, people whose names history would never record. And yet, crowds followed him wherever he went. Some came seeking answers. Others came seeking healing. Many simply wanted hope. They expected a revolutionary instead. They heard something entirely different. Rather than speaking about overthrowing Rome, Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, not as a distant empire waiting to arrive someday, but as something already breaking into the world through mercy, forgiveness, repentance, faith. He challenged the powerful, confronted hypocrisy, called people to love not only their neighbors, but even their enemies. He taught humility over status, compassion over revenge, service over power. For many, his words were unlike anything they had ever heard. For others, they were profoundly unsettling. And before long, his teachings would be accompanied by stories that spread even faster than his words. Stories spread quickly across Galilee. Some claimed Jesus had healed the sick. Others said the blind had recovered their sight. There were reports of lepers being cleansed, storms calmed, thousands fed with only a few loaves of bread and fish. And perhaps most astonishing of all, a man named Lazarus was said to have returned from the dead. For Christians, these miracles stand as signs of Jesus' divine identity. Historians approach them differently. While the supernatural nature of these events lies beyond the methods of historical investigation, most scholars agree on one important point. Jesus quickly developed a reputation as a healer and miracle worker during his own lifetime. Whether viewed through faith or through history, people believed extraordinary things were happening around him, and belief has a remarkable power of its own. It drew crowds from every direction. Entire villages came to see him. People abandoned their work for the chance to hear him speak. Some traveled for days. Others carried sick relatives across miles of rough terrain. Every new gathering made his influence harder to ignore. Among those constantly at his side were 12 men who would eventually become known simply as the 12. They were not generals, not priests, not philosophers. Most came from humble backgrounds. Several were fishermen from the shores of the Sea of Galilee. One had worked collecting taxes for Rome. Another had belonged to movements that dreamed of Jewish independence. They were ordinary men who had no idea they were about to become the foundation of one of history's greatest movements. Together, they watched Jesus teach, heal, debate, travel from village to village. They also witnessed something else, the growing resistance. Not everyone welcomed his message. Some religious leaders questioned his authority almost immediately. Who was this carpenter from Nazareth to interpret Scripture with such confidence? Why did he forgive sins? Why did he eat with tax collectors? Why did he associate with people many considered unclean? His answers often challenged long-established traditions. His popularity only made matters worse. Every sermon attracted larger crowds. Every reported miracle increased public attention. Every passing week brought more questions. Then came an incident that dramatically intensified the conflict. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus entered the temple courts in Jerusalem and drove out merchants and money changers, declaring that the sacred place had become a den of robbers. Whether understood as a symbolic protest against corruption or as a direct challenge to the temple authorities, the message was impossible to ignore. For some, he was defending God's house. For others, he had crossed a dangerous line. Yet beyond the temple stood an even greater power, Rome. The Roman authorities cared little about theological disputes. Their concern was simpler: maintain order. Judea had already produced numerous revolts. Popular leaders appeared from time to time. Many claimed divine authority. Most ended the same way: swiftly, violently. Any man capable of attracting thousands of followers naturally attracted Roman attention. Whether Jesus intended a political revolution remains one of the most debated questions in modern scholarship. But intentions mattered less than appearances. As spring approached, Jerusalem prepared for Passover, and Passover changed everything. For most of the year, Jerusalem was a modest provincial city. But during the Great Feast, its population multiplied several times over. Pilgrims poured in from every corner of the Roman Empire, from Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Cyrene, even Rome itself. Markets overflowed. Animals filled the streets awaiting sacrifice. The temple courts became crowded from sunrise until nightfall. The atmosphere combined celebration, expectation, and tension. Because Passover was more than a religious festival. It commemorated Israel's liberation from Egyptian slavery. For a nation living beneath Roman occupation, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Roman governors understood this perfectly. Every Passover carried the possibility of unrest. Additional troops entered the city. Patrols increased. Watchfulness intensified. And this particular year, one man dominated every conversation: Jesus of Nazareth. According to the Gospels, he entered Jerusalem not riding a war horse like a conquering king, but seated upon a donkey. Crowds lined the road. Many spread their cloaks before him. Others waved palm branches. Voices echoed through the city. Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. To believers, these words fulfilled ancient prophecy. To nervous authorities, they sounded dangerously close to royal acclamation. Jerusalem had become a city holding its breath. Over the following days, Jesus continued teaching publicly inside the temple. The crowds grew larger. So did the anxiety surrounding him. Behind closed doors, religious leaders began searching for a way to arrest him without provoking the thousands who still regarded him as a prophet. Then the opportunity came from somewhere no one expected. One of his own disciples, Judas Iscariot. For 2,000 years, his name would become synonymous with betrayal. Yet history cannot tell us exactly why he acted. Ancient sources offer possibilities: money, disappointment, political frustration, misunderstanding, perhaps something more complicated. Whatever the motive, the decision altered history. On the evening before his arrest, Jesus gathered with his closest followers for one final meal. Today it is remembered around the world as the Last Supper. During that meal, according to the Gospels, he broke bread, shared wine, and instructed his disciples to remember him. Few understood what those words truly meant. Later that night, they walked beyond Jerusalem's walls to an olive grove known as Gethsemane. There, as his disciples struggled to remain awake, Jesus prayed. Then, lights appeared in the darkness: torches, temple guards, Roman soldiers, and Judas. He approached, not with a sword, but with a kiss. Within moments, Jesus was under arrest. The movement that had begun quietly among the villages of Galilee was about to face the greatest crisis in its brief history. For centuries, historians have examined the hours that followed. Ancient sources allow us to reconstruct much of what happened, though not every detail. According to the Gospel accounts, Jesus was first brought before Jewish religious authorities before being handed over to the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Unlike many of the people surrounding him that morning, Pilate was not interested in theological debates. His responsibility was political: keep the peace, protect Roman authority, prevent rebellion. Outside the New Testament, both the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus confirm that Pilate governed Judea during this exact period, placing these events firmly within the historical record. The legal proceedings themselves remain the subject of scholarly debate. The four Gospels emphasize different moments. Ancient legal customs are not always clear. Yet one conclusion is accepted by virtually every modern historian. Jesus of Nazareth was sentenced to death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. To the Romans, crucifixion was far more than an execution. It was psychological warfare, reserved primarily for slaves, bandits, rebels, and enemies of the empire. Victims were forced to suffer publicly. Their humiliation became part of the punishment. Every passerby received the same message. This is what happens to anyone who challenges Rome. According to the gospel narratives, Jesus was led through the crowded streets of Jerusalem, carrying the wooden crossbeam upon which he would die. The city that only days before had welcomed him with songs now watched in silence. Some mourned, some mocked. Most simply stared. Outside the city walls stood a rocky hill known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. There, Jesus was crucified alongside two other condemned men. Above his head, Roman authorities placed a written charge: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Whether intended as mockery or as the official reason for his execution, the inscription revealed how Rome interpreted the situation. Not merely a religious dispute, but a political one. By late afternoon, it was over. Jesus was dead. For his followers, everything they believed had collapsed within a matter of hours. Only days earlier, they had imagined the arrival of God's kingdom. Now, their teacher had been publicly executed by the greatest empire on earth. Fear spread quickly. Some disciples disappeared into the crowds. Others locked themselves inside borrowed rooms. The movement seemed finished. History suggested it should have been. Throughout the Roman world, charismatic leaders occasionally inspired devoted followers. Almost every movement ended the same way. Once the leader died, the movement dissolved. There was every reason to believe this one would as well. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus' body was placed inside a newly cut tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Jewish council. Because the Sabbath was approaching, the burial took place quickly. A massive stone sealed the entrance. The silence that followed appeared absolute. By every human expectation, this was the end. Then, 3 days later, everything changed. Before sunrise, several women who had followed Jesus returned to the tomb, intending to complete the burial customs interrupted by the approaching Sabbath. They expected to find a sealed grave. Instead, the stone had been moved. The tomb was empty. Exactly what happened next differs slightly among the 4 gospel accounts. Some describe one angel, others describe 2. Some focus primarily on Mary Magdalene. Others mention several women arriving together. To modern readers, these variations often become points of discussion. To historians, however, differences between independent ancient witnesses are common. What matters is what every account agrees upon. The tomb was found empty. What that means depends entirely upon the perspective of the observer. For Christians, the answer has remained unchanged for nearly 2,000 years. Jesus had risen from the dead. His resurrection became the foundation upon which Christianity itself would stand. As the Apostle Paul would later write, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile." For believers, everything begins here. History approaches the question differently. Historians can examine ancient documents, compare testimony, study archaeology, analyze political circumstances. They can investigate what people claim to have witnessed. But history cannot determine whether a miracle occurred. That question belongs to faith rather than historical method. Instead, historians ask something equally fascinating. How did belief in the resurrection spread so quickly? That question has no simple answer. Within weeks of Jesus' execution, the same disciples who had hidden behind locked doors suddenly appeared in public, not in another city, not in another province, but in Jerusalem itself, the very place where Jesus had been crucified. According to the New Testament, they proclaimed that they had seen him alive, again and again, individuals, groups, even according to Paul's earliest letters, more than 500 people at one time. Whether these accounts are understood as literal history, religious experience, or sincere conviction, one fact remains difficult to dismiss. Something transformed these frightened followers into remarkably confident witnesses. Peter, who only days earlier had denied even knowing Jesus, now publicly proclaimed him before enormous crowds. Men who had fled in fear willingly faced imprisonment, public beatings, eventually death. From a historical perspective, that dramatic transformation demands explanation. Different scholars have proposed different answers. Some accept the resurrection exactly as the New Testament records it. Others suggest visionary experiences born from profound grief. Others point towards psychological or communal phenomena. The debate continues today. It is unlikely ever to end. Yet, regardless of where one stands, the historical consequences are undeniable. Within weeks, the movement that should have disappeared began growing instead. Rapidly, the followers of Jesus gathered every day, shared meals, prayed together, cared for widows, supported the poor, shared their possessions. According to the Book of Acts, thousands joined them in Jerusalem. Whether every number recorded is exact remains debated. The overall direction does not. Christianity was expanding, and remarkably, its earliest followers did not believe they had founded a new religion. They still considered themselves Jews. They worshipped at the temple, observed many traditional customs, read the Hebrew scriptures. The difference was not that they had abandoned Judaism. The difference was that they believed Israel's promised Messiah had already come. Few could imagine how quickly that conviction would spread beyond Jerusalem, and eventually beyond Judaism itself. As the weeks became months, the message spread beyond the walls of Jerusalem. Travelers carried the story north into Galilee. Pilgrims returned home speaking of the crucified teacher whom many now called the risen Messiah. Small communities began appearing across Judea, then Samaria, then Syria. Each gathering looked remarkably similar. They met inside ordinary homes, shared bread and wine, read the Hebrew scriptures, prayed together, retold the story of Jesus. There were no churches, no cathedrals, no elaborate ceremonies, no powerful bishops. Only ordinary men and women convinced they had witnessed the beginning of something that would change the world. Not everyone shared their enthusiasm. To many Jewish authorities, the movement threatened religious unity. To Roman officials, any rapidly growing group centered around a man once executed for claiming kingship deserved careful attention. The fragile peace that followed Jesus' death was beginning to disappear. And among those most determined to end this movement stood a man whose name would become inseparable from the history of Christianity itself. Saul of Tarsus. If the early Christians had been asked to name their greatest enemy, most would have answered without hesitation. Saul. He was neither a Roman governor nor a military commander. He was something far more dangerous, a brilliant Jewish scholar, deeply devoted to the law of Moses, highly educated, passionately convinced that the followers of Jesus were leading Israel into dangerous error. Ironically, the man who would eventually carry Christianity farther than anyone else first became known for trying to destroy it. Born in the prosperous city of Tarsus, Saul grew up at the crossroads of cultures. Unlike the fishermen of Galilee, he was raised in one of the intellectual centers of the Eastern Roman Empire. Greek philosophy flourished there. Commerce connected the city to every corner of the Mediterranean. Saul inherited two identities. He was thoroughly Jewish, yet he was also a Roman citizen, a rare privilege that granted him important legal protections and freedom to travel throughout the empire. According to his own writings, he trained as a Pharisee. He knew the Hebrew scriptures by heart. He believed he was defending God's truth. To Saul, the followers of Jesus represented more than a theological disagreement. They proclaimed that a man publicly executed under Roman authority was Israel's promised Messiah. Even more astonishing, many called him Lord. To Saul, such claims bordered on blasphemy. The movement had to be stopped. According to the book of Acts, Saul witnessed the execution of Stephen, remembered as Christianity's first martyr, as stones struck Stephen's body. Saul stood nearby, approving of the execution. Rather than frightening the movement into silence, Stephen's death scattered believers into neighboring regions. Unintentionally, persecution accomplished the opposite of what its supporters intended. The message spread even farther. Determined to finish what had begun, Saul obtained authorization from the high priest to travel north toward Damascus. His mission was straightforward: find the followers of Jesus, arrest them, bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. Confident, determined, certain he was doing God's work, he began the journey. He never imagined he would arrive as a different man. The ancient Roman road stretched across rocky hills beneath the Syrian sun. Dust rose beneath every step. Then, something happened that would become one of history's most famous conversion accounts. According to the book of Acts, a brilliant light suddenly surrounded Saul. He fell to the ground. A voice called his name. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Startled, he asked who was speaking. The answer would define the rest of his life. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. For Christians, this moment marks Saul's encounter with the risen Christ. Historians cannot evaluate the supernatural nature of the experience. What they can observe is something equally extraordinary. At some point, Saul underwent one of the most dramatic transformations recorded in ancient history. The persecutor became the preacher. The hunter became the hunted. Almost overnight, the man who had pursued Christians began proclaiming that Jesus truly was the Messiah. Not everyone believed him. Many Christians feared his conversion was merely another trap. Some remained suspicious for years. Trust is difficult to rebuild, especially after years spent hunting the very people you now call brothers and sisters. Yet, time gradually proved the sincerity of his conviction. As his mission expanded, Saul became increasingly known by his Roman name, Paul. And unlike the original disciples, whose work remained focused largely on Jewish communities, Paul looked towards something much larger: the Roman Empire itself. Rome had unknowingly created the perfect environment for ideas to travel. Thousands of miles of carefully engineered roads linked distant provinces. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean with remarkable efficiency. Greek served as a common language throughout much of the Eastern Empire. The legal stability imposed by Rome allowed travelers to move farther than ever before. Everything designed to strengthen imperial control would soon carry a message Rome never intended to spread. Paul traveled relentlessly across Asia Minor, into Greece, eventually toward Rome itself. He preached in synagogues, debated philosophers in public squares, entered private homes, spoke with merchants, soldiers, slaves, government officials. Wherever he traveled, small Christian communities appeared. Some cities welcomed him, others rejected him violently, often. Both happened at the same time. As the movement expanded beyond its Jewish origins, one question threatened to divide it from within. Did non-Jewish converts have to become Jews before following Christ? It was no minor disagreement. It struck at the very identity of the movement. For centuries, Jewish life had been defined by circumcision, dietary laws, and ritual observance. Should Gentile believers adopt all these practices as well? Paul believed they should not. He argued that faith in Christ, not ethnic identity, stood at the center of salvation. His position sparked fierce debate, at times, personal conflict. Yet history would prove its significance by opening Christianity to Gentiles without requiring them first to become Jews. Paul transformed what might have remained a regional movement into a faith capable of reaching the entire Roman world without realizing it. Christianity had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. It was no longer confined to the people of Judea. It had become a religion with the potential to reach every nation connected by Roman roads. And before long, the empire itself would begin to notice. The growth of Christianity was gradual. It did not sweep across the empire overnight. For decades, the movement remained small enough that many Romans scarcely noticed it. Its followers owned no temples, held no political office, commanded no armies. They gathered quietly inside private homes, often after sunset. There they prayed together, read from the Hebrew Scriptures, repeated the teachings of Jesus, and shared a simple meal in remembrance of his final supper. To outsiders, these meetings appeared mysterious. Rumors flourished. Some accused Christians of secret crimes. Others misunderstood the symbolic language surrounding the body and blood of Christ, giving rise to bizarre accusations of cannibalism. Because Christians refused to worship the traditional Roman gods or to offer sacrifice to the emperor, they were often viewed not simply as followers of a strange religion, but as people who endangered the peace of the empire itself. Roman religion was woven into public life. Sacrifices honored the gods before military campaigns. Festivals united entire cities. The emperor himself was increasingly associated with divine authority. Participation was not merely an act of faith. It was a declaration of loyalty. Most people had no difficulty honoring many gods at once. Adding one more deity required little sacrifice. Christians, however, refused. They insisted that worship belonged to one God alone, and that Jesus, not Caesar, was Lord. To Roman ears, those words sounded dangerously political. The tension continued to build. Then, in the summer of AD 64, disaster struck the capital itself. Fire broke out in Rome. Driven by strong winds and surrounded by densely packed wooden buildings, the flames spread with terrifying speed. For 6 days and 7 nights, much of the city burned. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Thousands lost their homes. Ancient writers describe scenes of panic as families fled through smoke-filled streets, carrying whatever possessions they could save. Even today, historians continue to debate how the fire began. Some ancient sources blamed accident, others suggested arson. Many Romans suspected Emperor Nero himself, believing he wished to rebuild sections of the city according to his own grand designs. Whether those suspicions were fair remains uncertain. What is clear is that Nero desperately needed someone else to blame. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing only decades later, records what happened next. Nero accused the Christians. They were already unpopular, already misunderstood, already viewed with suspicion. They made convenient scapegoats. What followed marked the first major state-sponsored persecution of Christians by the Roman government. Tacitus describes horrific punishments. Some Christians were torn apart by wild animals in public spectacles. Others were crucified. Some, according to his account, were covered in flammable materials and burned alive at night to illuminate Nero's gardens. Whether every detail reflects the exact historical reality remains debated, but the broader picture is not. Christians suffered terribly, and for the first time. Following Jesus carried an unmistakable cost. Among later Christian traditions, both Peter and Paul are believed to have died during Nero's persecution. The New Testament does not record their deaths. The earliest surviving Christian writers, however, consistently associate both apostles with martyrdom in Rome during this period. Peter, according to tradition, requested to be crucified upside down, believing himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his teacher. Paul, as a Roman citizen, is traditionally believed to have been executed by beheading. Absolute certainty remains impossible. Yet, by the end of the 1st century, Christians across the empire already honored them as martyrs. Ironically, persecution achieved the opposite of its intended purpose. Executions silenced individual voices, but they amplified the message. Roman spectators watched men and women face death with astonishing composure. They saw slaves die beside wealthy citizens, women beside soldiers, old men beside teenagers, all refusing to renounce their faith. The question inevitably arose: what could inspire such extraordinary conviction? Christianity continued to spread, not because it possessed military power, but because ordinary believers carried it wherever Roman roads reached. Merchants introduced it into bustling ports. Soldiers carried it to distant frontiers. Prisoners brought it into cells. Travelers shared it across provinces. Bishops emerged to guide growing communities. Letters circulated between churches separated by hundreds of miles. The writings that would eventually become the New Testament were copied by hand and passed from congregation to congregation. Without realizing it, the Roman Empire had become the communication network through which Christianity expanded. Still, the road ahead would not become easier. The persecutions under Nero were only the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, the relationship between Christianity and Rome would swing between uneasy tolerance and brutal repression. Some emperors ignored the Christians almost entirely. Others considered them enemies of the state. Periods of peace were interrupted by waves of violence. Each generation wondered whether it might be the last. Yet each generation left behind more believers than the one before. By the beginning of the 3rd century, Christianity had reached nearly every major city of the empire. Its followers included merchants, craftsmen, teachers, government officials, members of wealthy households, even soldiers serving in the Roman army. It remained a minority religion, but no longer an insignificant one. Rome could no longer afford to ignore it. The greatest confrontation between imperial authority and the Christian faith was still to come, and it would emerge under an emperor determined to restore the old gods by destroying the new faith once and for all. At the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity had survived nearly 300 years. It had outlived governors, outlived emperors, outlived countless attempts to erase it. Yet no persecution had ever been organized on the scale of what was about to begin. In AD 303, Emperor Diocletian launched what historians now call the Great Persecution. Unlike the scattered outbreaks of violence that had come before, this campaign reached across much of the empire. Imperial edicts ordered churches demolished, sacred texts burned, Christian gatherings outlawed, clergy imprisoned, citizens required to offer sacrifice to the traditional Roman gods or face severe punishment. For Diocletian, this was not merely religious policy. It was an attempt to restore unity to an empire already showing signs of fracture. Rome had endured civil wars, economic crises, foreign invasions, and political instability. Many believed the ancient gods had withdrawn their favor. To preserve the empire, old traditions had to be restored. Christianity, with its refusal to participate in public sacrifice, appeared to threaten the very foundation of Roman society. Thousands suffered. Some surrendered their scriptures to the authorities. Others fled. Many were imprisoned. Many were executed. Yet, once again, the movement endured. And then, history took an extraordinary turn. In the autumn of AD 312, another Roman civil war reached its decisive moment. Two rivals claimed the imperial throne. One of them was Constantine. On the eve of battle, according to later Christian sources, Constantine experienced a vision unlike anything recorded in Roman history. He reportedly saw a radiant symbol in the sky, the sign associated with Christ. Alongside it appeared a message. In this sign, conquer. The historical details remain debated. Some ancient writers describe a vision. Others describe a dream during the following night. Modern historians continue to disagree over exactly what Constantine experienced. What cannot be disputed is what happened afterward. His soldiers marched into battle bearing the Chi Rho, the first two Greek letters of Christ's name, painted upon their shields, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine emerged victorious. The triumph reshaped the Roman world. The following year, together with Licinius, Constantine issued what became known as the Edict of Milan. Christianity was no longer illegal. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, followers of Jesus could worship openly without fear of persecution by the state. The transformation was astonishing. Only a few years earlier, Roman officials had been burning Christian scriptures. Now, the emperor himself was protecting the church. Christian communities emerged from hiding. Churches were constructed across the empire. Confiscated property was returned. Bishops became increasingly influential in public life. The relationship between Christianity and political power had changed forever. Yet peace brought new challenges. When survival is no longer the greatest concern, questions of belief moved to the forefront. As Christianity expanded, disagreements over doctrine spread with it. Who exactly was Jesus? How should his relationship to the Father be understood? Could Christians across the empire truly proclaim the same faith? These debates grew increasingly intense until Constantine made another decision that would shape Christian history for centuries. In AD 325, He summoned bishops from across the Roman world to the city of Nicaea. It was the first ecumenical council in Christian history. Men who only a generation earlier might have faced execution for their faith now traveled under imperial protection to debate theology before the emperor himself. The discussions were passionate, sometimes heated, but their purpose was unity. The council produced what became the Nicene Creed, affirming that Christ was begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. For millions of Christians today, those words remain a central declaration of faith. For historians, Nicaea represented something equally remarkable. A movement that had once gathered secretly inside private homes had become influential enough to shape the religious future of an empire. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity would become the empire's official religion. The change was almost unimaginable. The faith once condemned by Rome had become intertwined with Rome itself. The empire that had crucified Jesus now raised churches in his name. Looking back across 2,000 years, it is tempting to see this outcome as inevitable. It was anything but. At countless moments, history could have taken another path. If the movement had collapsed after the crucifixion, if the disciples had remained hidden, if Paul had never changed sides, if Nero's persecutions had succeeded, if Constantine had lost at the Milvian Bridge, Christianity might have remained a forgotten movement remembered only by a handful of historians. Instead, it crossed deserts, sailed oceans, outlived kingdoms, survived plagues, wars, schisms, reformations, revolutions. Empires that once believed themselves eternal disappeared into history. Babylon, Persia, Rome. Yet the movement born among fishermen in Galilee continued to spread. Today, more than 2 billion people identify themselves as Christians. Its scriptures have been translated into thousands of languages. Its churches stand on every inhabited continent. Its influence can be found in art, music, law, philosophy, literature, science, politics, and the daily lives of billions. Whether one approaches this story as a believer, a skeptic, or simply a student of history, one fact remains impossible to ignore. Few lives have shaped human civilization more profoundly than that of Jesus of Nazareth, a carpenter from an obscure village, a teacher who never commanded an army, a man executed by the greatest empire of his age, whose followers claimed that death itself had not been the end 2,000 years later. The question that first echoed through the streets of Jerusalem still remains. Who was Jesus? History can tell us where he lived, how he died, how his followers transformed the ancient world. But the answer to that final question has always belonged to each generation and to every individual who asks it. Fade to black